Hey Rob, thanks for telling me that. I'm sorry about that, guys. I just went through about two slides you couldn't see. Let me back up. There you go. Agenda, Visual Studio, overview. We're doing a DLL, as I mentioned, and plugins. I just put a tweet out on Twitter that was not really a good idea for me to do two webinars in 2 days in a row because it kind of takes it out of me, and this is why I forgot to push a button. So thank you again for fixing that for me, Rob and Jessica. Okay, so again, once your code is actually inside CRM, it gets executed normally. And as I just mentioned, the plugin models used by CRM, for instance, a perfect example is the full name on a contact. You have first name, middle name, last name. Well, did you ever wonder how those things are actually added together to make the full name? It's with the plugin, believe it or not. Okay, so that model is used throughout CRM itself, and sometimes actually it crashes. Their plugins will actually have an issue, and when you see the crash, you're like, "Why is that thing crashing? That's not mine." It's like, "Well, it's theirs. That's why." Okay, so let's talk about designing your plugin. So there are some considerations that we have to think about, and this kind of goes along the lines of why we're creating a plugin, should we create a plugin, and then how it will actually be used. Okay. So the first thing is what I call immediacy. Does the action need to happen immediately after a user performs something on the screen? Okay. So in other words, if a user types in a number into a field and you have a calculation that needs to happen, does the user need to see that? Okay. If it doesn't need to see that, see it happen immediately, can they wait for it to happen when they click the save button? Okay, plugins work at the platform layer, which means you have to do something to make it hit the database, which is the save button. Okay, if they do need to see it immediately, then that's a JavaScript application. Okay, the last thing to do with is, do we have any outside application, such as a portal or some kind of custom integration you might have that pushes data into CRM? Does your plugin need to fire when those things happen? Okay, the biggest thing with this is with JavaScript, again, it happens on the screen as people do stuff. So sometimes that's just how it has to happen because of the interaction, the way JavaScript works. I've actually created solutions where I had the same exact code in JavaScript and in a plugin. And I did that so that a user could click a button and have it recalculate the form, or they hit the save and it automatically recalculated it as it saved it. Okay, so we did both so that we could make sure that the data was always up to date, and if ever the user was in doubt, they could push the button and see the update in front of them. Okay, so those things do happen. Okay. I'm assuming everybody can see my slides move. Looks like it to me. Okay. Modification by non-developers. Do you have anything that needs to be modified by someone who is not the creator of the plugin? Okay. This may sound like a weird thing, but plugins are written again in C# or VB.NET, mostly C# these days. And if you have a change to that, then you have to actually have the developer who created it modify that. Okay. If a non-developer needs to make changes, is this something that they can do? Again, probably not. So when you're working with something like this, is this a JavaScript thing? Can the users, administrators, do they know JavaScript enough to make a change, or does it have to be inside a plugin? Okay. A secondary consideration with this is, does what you do, is it part of a larger picture? So in other words, if I have a component that I've created that does a specific thing, if I add that as a custom workflow activity instead of a standard plugin, and that gets compiled into a custom workflow, is that's all that's needed. So in other words, do I have logic that the non-developers can create with workflows? Then they just call my specific pieces that I wrote as a custom workflow activity plugin, so that they don't need to know how to use them. They just have those features available to them. That's where this kind of comes from. Okay, on-demand application. Is there ever a possibility that what you're doing needs to be done on a kind of ad hoc basis? In other words, does the user need to make a decision to start the process? Okay. When you create a plugin, and we'll see this here in a few slides, when you create a plugin, you assign it to an action like a create or an update or whatever. It happens every single time. There is no option to turn it off or on, or not to do it or not do it based on whatever. It happens pretty much every single time. So if you ever get into a situation where you need to create a piece of code that is only executed by hand, manually, then that is actually a custom workflow activity. The code is almost exactly the same. The kind of the window dressing around it that you start up the file with is a little bit different. But other than that, what you're creating is something that can be called from a workflow, and workflows can, of course, be run on demand. So that's what this is for. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, the final thing here is if you look at how the code has to run, there are certain environments, either CRM Online or an on-premise environment or a hosted environment, where your plugins have to work in what we call sandbox mode. Sandbox mode is basically the ability to run in a restricted context. In .NET terms, it's what we call a partial trust model instead of a full trust model. And what this does is allows the system to isolate the code so that if it crashes, it doesn't take the entire server down or the service down in the case of IIS. It only affects the little box it's working in. So with Dynamics CRM Online, you can only deploy sandbox plugins. If you have, depending on your security level, there's a thing called a deployment administrator if you're on-premise. Deployment administrator is set up inside the deployment management tool. It's only set up there. It's not something that can be set from any of the security roles within the system. Deployment managers are the only ones who can deploy non-sandbox plugins to a CRM environment. If you're not a deployment manager, you will get an error when you try to deploy it. And that includes solutions. If your solution is not running in sandbox mode and you attempt to install it, it will fail, and it will give you a strange error message that pretty much says you don't have the ability to install this type of plugin. Okay, so most of the time, everything will work inside of a sandbox mode. There's some few things it can't do. We'll talk about those in a little bit. But this is a consideration depending on your environment, that your final environment, such as CRM Online, on-premise or hosted, and then what the code actually does. Some things will not work in sandbox mode. Okay, let's talk about the plugin components and configuration. So as I mentioned, a plugin is a physical DLL. Inside of that is a .NET class, and then when you actually register the plugin, you create a step, and a step is a configuration that identifies what action will take place, and then we can have some data associated with that as well. So in the case here, what we have is in the example, we have the create of a list and an update of a list. List is marketing list if you've never seen it, the internal version. And then what we're doing here is we're actually creating what we call post image, which is basically a database query that was run and given to the plugin. It's run by CRM, and it contains the owner ID. Okay, and we'll get into those in a little bit. But basically, we have an assembly, which contains one or more plugins, which contains steps, which can contain images. Those are the last one's optional. So where and when do I execute my plugin? So the first thing you have to do is, in most cases, set up the entity that it's associated with, like the account, contact, etc. Some messages, like the associate message, are not actually associated with any specific entity. They run on what they call any entity. It's kind of a weird thing that we'll have to talk about one time, and I guess in class or something. We select the message that causes the activation. Again, create, update, delete, things like that. Are we going to be running in synchronous mode or asynchronous mode? Okay. Can anybody tell me the difference? Nobody knows the difference between asynchronous and synchronous? Yeah, David. Yeah, David got it. Async is running in the background. Okay. So the idea here is an asynchronous mode, in the case of plugins, is physically run by a totally separate service. Synchronous plugins are actually run by IIS. Okay, so they're part of the website services themselves. Synchronous plugins, when an error is encountered, will display an error to the user. Okay, it's what I call the big red X. So it's the box with the big red X on it saying something bad happened. Okay, asynchronous, since it's run by the asynchronous service in a second-hand mode, does not show any errors on the user interface. They are shown in the system job table. So that's where you look for those kind of things. The difference between the two is really what has to do with kind of convenience and things like that. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. And then the last thing to think about is where does our plugin need to fit within the chain of events here? And we'll get into the event model here in just a second. But we can either run the plugin before the data hits the database or after the data hits the database. And there are reasons to do one or the other depending on how you're working. So plugin messages, again, things like create, update, assign, retrieve multiple, promote email, things like that. Okay. If you're ever curious about what you can do with the plugin, there is a worksheet called message-entity support for plugins.xlsx. It's in the root folder of the SDK when you unzip it. And it has a list of all of the messages by entity. So if you're ever in a curious mode, okay, which one do I use here? That's how you do that. Some of them are not exactly obvious, okay? Like for lead, for opportunity, those have things like qualified, disqualified, won, lost, depending. So they're not actually updates or deletes or deactivations or anything like that. They're actually a specific thing that happens. So if you're ever curious about stuff like, well, I'm doing this action and then it does something. Well, if it's not really and truly one of the top 5 there, then it may be something special. And that something special is going to be 100% dependent on what's happening. So the best thing to do is open up that worksheet, do a filter by entity, and then see what's available to you. Okay? So going back to the synchronous, asynchronous thing, again, synchronous is done with the user involved in the conversation. So there's a couple of things here. If you are doing something that has a possibility of failure or needs to report back something that happened to the user, you have to run in synchronous mode because, again, that's the only way that's going to happen. Okay? Unfortunately, the only communication that gets back to the user is in the form of an error. There's no informational. It will pop up with the big red X, with the big scary message. They could just say, it worked. It's still a big scary message because it's still an error. Okay? Asynchronous it happens as soon as practical, but without user involvement. Realistically, if your operation takes more than a few seconds to perform and the user does not care if the output or the outcome is good or bad, you make it asynchronous. Again, it's all about the user and your interaction with them. So if you have something that runs for a couple minutes and you need it to happen, then basically you put it off to the async service. Okay. We have a thing here called a plugin stage, and this is the definition of where within the pipeline we would like our thing to be executed. So we have 3 really. Number 30, which is the main platform core operation, you can't do anything about that. That's where CRM does its work. Okay, but we can do two things before it does its work and one thing after it does its work. So the pre-event is raised before the core operation and before the database transaction has started. Okay, so what is different about this versus the pre-validation versus the pre-operation is there is a thing called a transaction, and this is a database terminology, quite honestly. So a transaction is the way that CRM wraps our entire whatever we're doing, like a create or whatever. If one of the things fails, it will roll back the entire transaction. Okay? So what happens here is most of the time it's not a huge deal, but the pre-validation and pre-operation can modify the data going to the database. A common example of that is the automatic numbering feature of several different free and commercial add-ons out there. So we have an account number that we want to update automatically. So what would happen is we would have a plugin execute on pre-validation, and then what would happen is it would go get the next available account number, and then we would actually populate the account number field as it's going into the database. Okay, so it didn't start off being populated, but by the time the core operation got it, it was populated. We can actually do the reverse. Believe it or not, you can actually remove things from the entity being updated. Okay, so I know it sounds kind of odd, but every now and then I've actually run across and actually created a situation where in certain cases we don't want to update certain types of information, so we will literally remove those fields from the data going into the database, and it's like they were never touched. Okay, a post operation will happen after the database operation. So some things can only be loaded or can only be run in a pre-event, and some things can only be run in a post-event. A perfect example is if we create a new record in CRM, do we have an ID for that record before it's saved to the database? If it's done manually, no. The answer is no. Programmatically, we can supply one, but for the sake of this conversation, let's pretend no. The problem is we have to do something with that ID. Say we're creating other records. Okay, well, we can't run on a pre-event because we have no ID. So our only choice is to run as a post-event. Okay, likewise, if we're deleting a record, are we going to have a record to look at on the post-event? The answer is no, because we've deleted the record. But we do have a record to look at on the pre-event. Okay, so things like that. So you just have to, the location it can run and is going to totally 100% correspond to the type of message it is. Okay, so whenever you pick certain types of messages, it will automatically, the plugin registration tool will automatically enable or disable things that are invalid. So it knows these things up front. So here is an example of the execution pipeline for a synchronous non-sandbox plugin. So the first thing that happens is a pre-validation, followed by the pre-operation, followed by the platform operation. Again, that's where CRM does the work, which puts it in the database, and then the post operation is called. Okay, so assuming everything worked, it would come back to the user and you have your information. So who can tell me when you are filling out a record, say we're creating a new account and we type all the information in, who can tell me what the second thing to happen after we click the save button? Tell me what that is. Anybody know? Nobody? That's very strange. Okay, here's a little education for you. It does more than you think it does. It's not visible as it used to be with 2013 and 2015. 2011 is blatantly obvious what was going on. When you click the save button, it does two exact things. The first thing it does is it saves the record. The second thing is it retrieves the record and it displays it to you again. Okay, with 2015, 2013, it doesn't refresh the screen, but 2011 and before, you could physically see the page being rebuilt. Okay, so remember we were talking about that pre-operation, pre-validation. We were updating the account number. By us modifying the data stream going into the database, what we ended up doing was giving that data back to the user. So when they click the save button, they would automatically see that account number being populated in the account number field without us doing anything at all besides supplying it to the database. Okay, that's why this is kind of important. So here is an asynchronous non-sandbox execution. Okay, so the first 4 phases exactly the same: pre-validation, pre-operation, platform with the database. Then what happens is it throws it over to the async service, which can either be on the CRM server, which is the default, or if you have it moved or a different copy of the async service running on a different server, it will be thrown over there. It actually runs it in a post-operation mode over there. Okay. So one thing about the post-operation here is async operations can only be run in a post-operation mode. Anybody know why? First person to answer gets a free puppy. Last person to answer gets a free puppy. No answers? Okay. Asynchronous operations can only work on the records that exist, pretty much. So in order for the the operation to execute in a asynchronous mode, it really only runs in post-operation. In other words, you can't really run an async on a create because it has to put it in the database first. Okay. So let's talk about plugin registration. So part of the SDK is a tool that will actually add our plugin and allow us to configure it. It's called the plugin registration tool. It's in the tools folder, starting at the 2013 level. And its job is to actually add the plugin assembly to the database, either in the database or just a reference to it if you keep it on disk, which is a possibility. Then it allows you to actually do the other configuration. So we have 3 places to put it, as you can see at the bottom: in the database, on the disk, or in the global assembly cache. In all honesty, since about 2011, I don't think I've done any kind of work that didn't involve it going in the database, strictly because we have the solution model. And the way this works is you generally add the plugin to the database, you configure it, and then add the plugin assembly and the SDK message processing step, which is the long phrase that is actually the step itself, to a solution, and then from that point forward, moving it to other places, you actually use the solution and not the plugin registration tool to do that with. So everything is pretty much in the database at this point. You can still put it on disk, which has to be placed on the CRM server itself in a specific folder. But again, since 2011, I really have not done that at all. Maybe once or twice, and that was probably just for testing. Okay. So this is what the interface looks like. So after you've connected to CRM, it will display a list of all of your plugins and custom workflow activities. So here you can see a variety of things. So we've got some things that I wrote. I've got some commercial products, Microsoft products, the activity feeds or Microsoft stuff there. Okay, so this is the interface. So when I create a step, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the assembly, and then I'm going to declare how it's going to be executed and what information is going to be passed to that execution. So the first thing I select is a message. So again, that's like the create, update, etc. Then I pick the primary entity, which is most of the time available to us depending on the message. I can specify a list of filtering attributes. This is a really cool feature that literally tells CRM, if the attributes coming to you are not in this list, do not execute this plugin. Okay, so that's a way to increase performance of your system so that your plugin doesn't execute unnecessarily. Okay, we can specify a user to run the plugin under. This happens occasionally where you have a plugin that needs to be run under a higher security context than the current user. Most of the time, the plugin is run as the user who started the operation. but occasionally we have work to do where we have to be run as the administrator, for instance, strictly like say maybe we're creating records within the system that the current user doesn't have the ability to create. So we do that under a different user. You can specify the execution order in case you have multiple plugins on the same entity and they have to be done in a specific order. That happens occasionally. The pipeline stage, again, where it should be run, pre, post, synchronous, asynchronous, if it should be run on the server, in the Outlook client, or both. Believe it or not, you can actually have a plugin that runs on the Outlook client when it's in a disconnected mode. I've never ever done that in the 10 years I've been working with CRM. There's lots of things you have to consider when you're doing that, and most of the time, everything's going to run on the server anyway. So it's a capability we have, but I've just never used it. And then finally, we have two configuration boxes that we can get to that will allow us to actually put in configuration information to be passed to the plugin. And this is what it looks like. Okay. So basically, if you fill out the first two things, maybe the run in context, user's context, maybe the execution order, and the pipeline stage, the execution mode, and the deployment. Okay, and then again, the secure configuration and unsecure configuration, those are optional. If you have secure information to pass into the plugin to provide security, that's a means of not hard coding things that change from one place to the other. Okay. Okay, so that's pretty much how plugins work from a configuration and overall perspective. Does anybody have any questions on what plugins are or how we actually get them into the system? No? Okay. So when you're developing plugins, I'm going to give you 3 different ways that you can lay out your projects and your solution. So I'm assuming that everybody is at least passingly familiar with Visual Studio. So we have a solution, and then we can have multiple projects within the solution, of course. One way to do this is to have a solution that, well, you know, like, hang on one second, I think I'm getting ahead of myself. Oh, sorry. This should be project. Have a project that has multiple plugin classes in it. So you'll create one DLL with 3 plugins in it. Okay, that's option 1. Option 2 is to create one solution with one project in it as a plugin, and then do that for every plugin you have. I see this done a lot. This is a lot of work, and the reason it's a lot of work is you now have 3 different assemblies to register instead of one assembly, which is what you would get up here. Okay. A third thing is a way to do it where you have one project, again, solution should say project. Then you have a folder called entities, and then you have a folder called account, and then each of the plugins you actually have a specific naming scheme, such as account, pre-create, sync. So that tells me that I'm going to run on the account entity, it's going to be a pre-create mode, and it's going to be synchronous. Okay. This design I got from a friend of mine whose company does this, and what they do, they've actually written a custom plugin registration tool, and it uses what we call reflection to actually look at the name, and based on the name, it actually goes and automatically registers the plugin, so they don't have to do it manually. And the reason they have it because they have several hundred plugins. Okay, so these are 3 different ways to actually lay out your stuff. I like number 1. So what I generally do is I create a solution with a single project in it, and then each one of my plugins is in a separate class. Okay, and then therefore for that project I only have one DLL to register, not a bunch of them. Again, this one here where you have 3 different DLLs you have to register, this doesn't sound like a big deal until you have to go and open each one and compile it, and then open another and compile it. Having one solution to compile is probably the best. Sean asked if reflection is a good performance-wise. It's not a performance issue. It's basically a maintenance issue. So basically what you're talking about with this is they wrote a custom tool, okay, to register it, and that's so they wouldn't have to manually do it. So they made some assumptions, and they are applying those assumptions against the code base. So it's really not a performance thing that we're using here. Again, this is only registration. This is not activation of it. This is only to register it within the system. Okay, so we've got a couple of assemblies that we have to reference when we're working with plugins. We have the Microsoft.xrm.sck.dll and then crm.sck.pluxy.dll. So these two have to be there to give us the information to work with CRM. The bottom two, System Runtime Serialization and System Service Model, those are standard .NET things that are used by the CRM assemblies to actually do the work. So these four are the minimum you have to have. Okay. So, Sean asked another question. Do you prefer assembly in one plugin or a group of plugin with a single assembly? Well, like I said, I really prefer one assembly if I can get away with it, strictly because it makes deploying it much easier. But you do bring out a point. It brings out that working in large project support is difficult. That is true, and we're not really talking about that in this webinar, maybe in a different webinar. But when you get into a team development effort, it takes a little bit of consideration and organization in order to actually make these things work better. Okay. Strictly because the more cooks you have in the kitchen, the more harder it is to actually make a meal. Okay, assemblies must be signed. So that's just as simple as going into the project and click on the signing tab and giving it a name. The plugin registration will fail without it. That was a change a long time ago. You didn't know that the thing wasn't signed until you executed it, and it failed then in front of the user. So at least now they've fixed that. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of the code. So this is the structure of how we're actually going to construct the plugin itself. So our plugin class is inherited from an interface called IPlugin. So this is a constructor for that. So there is a standard constructor just called myPlugin, for instance, and then there's a version that has the ability to accept secure information and unsecure information. These are just strings, and these strings are the data that is in the two white boxes on the plugin step itself. So when the plugin is executed, CRM is going to pull the information out of the plugin registration step and then stick it into these two strings, and then you can pull it out and use it from there within your plugin. There is a single method within the IPlugin class called execute. This is what CRM uses to actually figure out what to do. It only does one thing, and it knows this is what I'm doing. Okay, you pass in a one parameter, which is an iService provider, and that has everything that you need to know about what you're doing, either the environment you're working in or the current operation. Everything is inside of that. So the first thing we do is we actually pull off the execution context. So that gives us a lot of information about the environment itself. Okay, so we pull that out first. And then here are the things within the context. So we have a thing called depth. So that's how many times this thing has been run within the current execution. It is possible for you to actually create a plugin that calls itself. If you do that, it's 7 or 8 times in a row, CRM will terminate the process because it realizes you're in an infinite loop. Okay? You can get the initiating user ID. You can get the input parameters. So those are things going into the plugin. Usually it's the thing you're working on, such as the record, like you're creating a record or updating a record. That will be inside of the input parameters. The message is what started it, such as the create or update, the mode, if that helps, synchronous, asynchronous. Output parameters are used in the post operation. So for instance, we were talking about earlier, creating a new record, the output parameters would actually have the ID of the record that was created, whereas the input parameters would have the data about what was going to be created, but the output parameters would actually have the ID. Parent context is not really kind of used anymore to a point. There was at one point a distinction between a child pipeline and a parent pipeline. there were certain operations within CRM that would fire off related operations, and you could run your plugin inside of those, and it was actually literally different data pipeline. So sometimes you had to understand which one you were in. Post and pre-images, these are actually database queries that you set up when you register the step and saying, I would like data passed to me. And the data could be data before the database operation happened or changed, so that would be the pre-operation, or it could be the data after the database changed. Now, you can do this yourself, but anytime you have CRM do the query for you, it's going to be much, much faster than you doing the query yourself. We also have the entity ID and the primary entity ID and the primary entity name. That's the ID for the, if we have one, for the record being worked on, the entity being worked on, what stage of the pipeline it's in, and then finally the user ID who actually started this. Okay, so these are all things that we can make use of. And what is so cool about these is you can actually make a quote-unquote generic plugin. And using things like the primary entity ID and the primary name and things like that, you can actually have one plugin that works across a variety of entities, and you just check the primary entity name and say, okay, an account, the auto number is a perfect example. If I'm I have my own auto number and I'm going to work on contact and account and opportunity, then I can just check, okay, for my primary entity name, if it's account, I'm going to go run this routine to get the account, the next account number. If it's a contact, the next contact number. If it's an opportunity, the next opportunity number. So that's what that's for. So rather than creating 3 plugins to handle that same exact scenario, we create one plugin that just gets used by all 3 operations. So when you're working with plugins, you can access the CRM organizational service. This is the one that actually does the interaction with the CRM web services. So if you need to be able to create records or retrieve records or delete records or whatever it might be within the plugin, you have to have a handle to the organizational service. So this is the method that gets us that. Okay. Now, you don't have to have a plugin do stuff like this. Your plugin can be very simple. It can actually be as simple as taking data and then combining it together and then giving it back to CRM without ever touching the database elsewhere. Excuse me, one second. Okay. So this is the last step of getting stuff. So once we have a handle to the CRM service, we can actually perform these other calls that we normally do with .NET programming. Okay, as I mentioned, the input parameters are data coming into the plugin. So what we're looking for is we have a handle to the context. We're checking the input parameters in this example to see if it contains an input parameter called target, and then we're making sure that the target is a type of entity. Okay, entity is the generic entity class for all CRM entities. Okay, so this is what we call the base class. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pull a reference out of that and put it into a variable called entity. And then from that point forward, anything that we're doing, this is a reference, okay? Say this is a contact that we're updating. We can update any of the fields on this entity variable, and they will automatically be referenced back into the input parameters, be updated, and when the actual CRM operation takes place, whatever changes you've made to the entity will be reflected in that data stream. Okay, this is kind of big. Sorry, so kind of small because of so much of it. This is actually a real plugin. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're getting a handle to the context. We're creating a handle to the CRM service. There is also a tracing service that will record information should the plugin fail, and only if it fails, it will actually write it out. Okay, so we're checking to see if we have a post image called post image, and if we do, we're actually pulling that out. We're also looking for the full name from the record. This happens to be a contact, so full name is what we're after. Okay, then we're getting the primary name, entity name here. This thing here actually creates a SharePoint document library is what it does. So then it goes out and it does a retrieve of the default site for that information and gets the parent folder name, and then it starts a process to actually create a document library for that contact, and then it pre-populates it with a specific set of folders. Okay. So if you've ever worked with SharePoint and CRM, what this does is when you normally click on a contact or an account or whatever record type it may be that does not have a document library associated with it, it'll pop up and say, hey, you don't have one, would you like to create one, yes or no? If you click yes, it will hang up there for a second and go over to SharePoint and create the library and then display it to you. This will do this automatically. So this is tied to a create of an account, of the contact, and as soon as this is done, if you clicked on the documents link on the contact, you would see the document library with the folders that were created. Okay, so this is a real live thing. Okay, I know that's a lot of information. Okay, this, like I said, I went a little bit more beyond basic, but I thought this is what you needed to know to get you started. So, what questions do we have? You can either hold your hand, or do you raise your hand, or you can type it in. If you want to do it in person, just raise your hand and I'll unmute you. Somebody has to be first, by the way. Okay. Gashan asked, how do you handle business unit specific plugin? I am using unsecure config. Is there a better option? The only way you're going to be able to handle that is to you can use a configuration type, but you have to check the business unit for the person who's executing the code. There's no other way to do that. Okay. Nigel says, thank you, good webinar. You're welcome. Thanks for coming. Anybody else? Is there any, David asks, guys, any modern book references? Hang on one second. We'll talk about that. Anybody else? Gauchon asks again, how to use actions and plugins. You know what? I've never done an action. I have a chapter in a book I'm working on that I'm about to talk about that I'm going to talk about that. So if you guys don't know what an action is, remember we talked about the messages that come through, such as the create update. An action is a way to kind of create these things yourself. And an action is kind of I'm going to say it's a type of plugin. It's technically not, but it's very, very close. So it enables you to do things programmatically that get called, and there's not really a lot of good documentation on it. I've never actually had a need to do it, but maybe I'm just not looking in the right place. Okay. Okay, Cynthia asks, well, there are multiple plugins triggered in the same context. How do you can you better order the sequence of execution? That is 100% trial and error. So when you add a plugin step to an entity, the default I think is either 0 or 1. So what's going to happen is they all execute at the same time. That is generally a bad thing. Some plugins get very, very upset if somebody starts playing with their sandbox. Okay, so there's no rhyme or reason to that, but some plugins have to be executed before others or after others, so there's no way to do it other than just taking a look and just trial and error. You will know it because what will happen is you will get errors, and errors that make no sense is generally what you see, where perfectly functioning code fails to work, and that's generally because it got stepped on by somebody else. And so kind of same thing. Conflicting plugins are generally they're executing at the same time because their execution order is the same. So the easiest way to do it, the step-by-step would be disable, say you had two. Let's keep it simple. Have two. turn one of them off. Disable one step and then run it. Do you cause an error? No. Okay, then switch the disablement to the other one. Does that one run? Fine. Okay. If they're producing an error together, then modify the execution order to say one is 1 and one is 99. And if that works, then maybe that's your solution. And you can swap it back and forth. But again, there's no rhyme or reason. It's 100% trial and error. There's nothing I can give you that's going to tell you this is exactly how you do it, because it's going to be 100% dependent. I've written plugins that should have not had any problem with anything, and they got all mad because something else ran before them or ran at the same time. No rhyme or reason. It just happened. So you just got to play with it. So Bob asks, do you only need to register the DLL once in the plugin registration tool and not in the subsequent environments? That's what the solutions are for. So again, the process is in your dev environment, you register the solution, the plugin, you put in your plugin steps, any plugin images that you need, then you add those things to your solution. When you export your solution out to import it into another environment, all that information will be included. The key there is when you're adding it to the solution, you have to add your plugin assembly and then your SDK message processing steps. Those are the two things that are together. Okay, so once you're in the solution model, you should be fine. If all else fails, you can always connect to those environments directly, assuming you have security to do it, and you can deploy them directly. Gusson, yes, you can use the external toolbox to do stuff too. And he mentions, yeah, it happens a lot when you have a plugin on the retrieve. Yeah, putting a plugin on a retrieve operation is very, very fraught with peril. So be very, very careful if you do that. You can do it. So what we're talking about, when you do a retrieve, which is retrieving a single record, or you do a retrieve multiple, which is doing a query, you can actually, believe it or not, change things. I have actually written a plugin that will modify physically the query of a retrieve multiple operation. Okay, very, very scary stuff, but it did work. Okay, and what we were doing is we were actually adding additional filter criteria. Okay, I've done it once in my entire career. Okay, but it is possible. Oh, very good question. By new, I hope. During the update plugin step is a post image step. Do we need to keep all attributes or only specific attributes required? Okay, great question. So kind of back up for a second here. Well, I'll just keep it here. So these plugin images, again, are basically entities that have been queried on by CRM. The default is to pull all attributes back. And like any good database operation, pulling back all of the fields of a record is not very good performance-wise, right? Only pull back the things you need. Yes, it's a little work for you, but you know what? That's why you get paid the big bucks, have the company call her corner office. Okay, so only pull back the fields you need. Nothing kind of irritates me more than come into a situation where I see they're doing either a retrieve and pulling back all columns, or doing a post pre-image and they have all attributes set. There are occasions where, it's just easier to do that than to pick, say, 7 out of 12 or 7 out of 10 or whatever it might be. Just do all attributes. It's not a big deal. But you think about contact and account where you have somewhere between 125 and 200 attributes. Do you need all that? No, you don't. Okay, it's going to slow the system down every single time that you run that plugin. Sean asked, how do you write custom code on an entity that does not support plugins? I don't think you can. Sai asks, if the same plugin is registered by multiple developers, are they considered different plugins? No, there's only one environment. It actually goes by ID. So if somebody registers the same plugin, it's going to be overwritten if it's already there. Okay, that happens occasionally in a multi-development environment. What happens is I'm registering something, and then you're registering something, and I have the update. And what happens is whoever updates last wins. Okay. Again, that's a team development thing. There's nothing. This is a process issue, not a technology issue. You can't fix it with technology. You just got to basically coordinate your updates. Okay. If at all possible, have one person in charge of doing the actual deployment of a plugin. Doesn't always work, but if you can, try that. Rochelle asks, is there a limit to the length of names of the columns that you specify your plugin? Not to my knowledge. Yeah, like her example, I'm assuming you're her, I apologize if not. 200 properties, you specify 50 of them. I have never seen a limit hit. That's a good question, though. Yeah, I've never seen it. It's a string, and strings within C# can be quite long, so you should not hit a limit. If you do, then that's probably some kind of design flaw. Anybody else? No? Okay. So David asked earlier, I do have a book coming out. It is basically part of my deep dive series, and it's on plugins. I've been working on it for a while, so things keep changing, which keeps pushing me off. Like right now, I have to go and reshoot all my screenshots because the plugin registration tool is the same but different. So right now it's I got a pre-release price of $39.95. It's going to ship at $59.95. If you go out to tinyurl.com/deep dive plugin book, you can go to my page and see that. I got a simple table of contents. So basically, what we're talking about is the stuff we talk about here. More detail. I give you some templates to start out with. There's going to be a lot of examples in there of things that you can do to actually test out your knowledge, and it's going to be kind of like I said, it's a deep dive into plugin creation. So I'm hoping to ship it sometime in October. First couple weeks is my goal, but that could be dependent on real work and stuff like that. Okay. I've got some more training coming up here. So next week is my .NET developer training. So this is 5 days of training everything from .NET stuff and plugins, custom workflow activities, JavaScript, UI customization. It's the full gamut there. So if you're interested in that, take a look at tinyurl.com/.NET CRM developer, and you can get more information there, or just send me an email and we can talk about it. Registration ends Thursday at noon Central Time because I have to get the VM spun up. Okay. If that is not good enough for you, or it's too long, or probably you're already educated, I do have 2 other classes I teach. So these are specific to the topic. So I have one on JavaScript development. It's 2 days, and then I have another 2-day class on plugin development. So if you go out to either one of these URLs here, you can basically at the bottom is a form. Just put your name on my mailing list, and the next time that I have one of these, I can email you, and we can try to get a course created. Right now, I don't have any interest at all in these 2 classes. So if you are interested, just let me know, and as soon as we get enough people wanting to do it, we'll have one. Vikesh, delivery of the book to the UK, I do all my printing through Amazon. So basically, it's Amazon UK, so it'll be local. The first iteration is going to be an ebook, and then I'll get the print book and the Kindle book out in that order. Okay. Thanks everybody for coming. If anybody has any questions, feel free to email me, and I really appreciate your time today. And don't forget, this recording will be up on YouTube later today. Well, actually, you know what? It won't, probably not later today, probably first thing in the morning.